Hi, everyone. Freddie Kiger, and welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me and us. This is a part of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill General Alumni Association North Carolina series, and one of our own, not only here at the university, but in the Tar Heel State, this episode about Thomas Wolfe. And so we dive in with a passage from Look Homeward, Angel. Thank you for joining us. The university was a charming and unforgettable place. It was situated in the little village of Pulpit Hill, in the central Midland of the big state. Students came and departed by motor from the dreary tobacco town of Exeter, 12 miles away. Countryside was raw, powerful, and ugly, a rolling land of field, wood, and hollow. But the university itself was buried in a pastoral wilderness, a long tabling butte which rose steeply above the country. One burst suddenly at the top of the hill on the end of the straggling village street, flanked by faculty houses and winding a mile into the town center and the university. Central campus sloped back and up over a broad area of rich turf, groved with magnificent ancient trees. A quadrangle of post-revolutionary buildings of weathered brick bounded the upper end. Other newer buildings, in the modern sense, and in modern bad manner, the pedagogic neo-Greek, were scattered around beyond the central design. Beyond, there was a thickly forested wilderness. There was still a good flavor of the wilderness about the place. One felt its remoteness, its isolated charm. It seemed to Eugene like a provincial outpost of great Rome. The wilderness crept up to it like a beast. In this pastoral setting, the young man was enabled to loaf comfortably and delightfully through 4 luxurious and indolent years. There was, God knows, seclusion enough for monastic scholarship, but the rare romantic quality of the atmosphere, the prodigal opulence of springtime, thick with flowers and drenched in a fragrant warmth of green shimmering light, quenched pretty thoroughly any incipient rash of bookishness. Instead, students loafed and invited their souls, or with great energy and enthusiasm, promoted the affairs of glee clubs, athletic teams, class politics, fraternities, debating societies, and dramatic clubs. And they talked. Always they talked. Under the trees, against the ivied walls, assembled in their rooms, they talked. In limp sprawls, incessant, charming, empty Southern talk. They talked with a large, easy fluency about God, the devil, and philosophy. The girls, politics, athletics, fraternities, and the girls, my God, how they talked. And so, 9 years after he graduated, Thomas Wolfe, in that passage, as Eugene Gant, reminisced about Durham, Chapel Hill, and the University of North Carolina. It was in 1929 when Charles Scribner's Sons published his sprawling novel, a thinly disguised autobiography entitled Look Homeward, Angel, a story of the buried life. In truth, some 200 pages of his work immortalize his 4-year stay at Carolina, which began Tuesday, September the 12th, 1916, when Thomas Clayton Wolfe came to town. 3 weeks short of his 16th birthday, and already a towering 6'3", he was a reluctant freshman at the University of North Carolina. The youngest of 8 children to William Oliver and Julia Westall Wolfe, he was born the 3rd of October, 1900. He lived the first 6 years of his life at 92 Woodfin Street in Asheville. It's a house that his father, a stone cutter in town, had built for the second of his three brides. Tom's mother and W.O.'s third wife, Julia, complained that she was living in both a second-hand house with a second-hand husband. Despite her jibe, she bore W.O. 8 children, all born at 92 Woodfin. On August the 30th, 1906, in a move to cash in on the growing tourist trade streaming to Asheville, Julia purchased a boarding house on 48 Spruce Street. Only 2 blocks from 92 Woodfin, this 18-room house was called the Old Kentucky Home. In Wolfe's Look Homeward Angel, he referred to it as Dixieland, and Asheville was Altamont. Julia moved in to manage the place, and she took 6-year-old Tom with her. That move made him feel insulated from his family, and that isolation was a constant theme in much of his writing. In fact, he later described himself as a vagabond since I was 7, with 2 roofs and no home. After 6 years of elementary school, John Mancy Roberts became principal of Asheville's Orange Street School. To recruit students for a private academy he planned for boys, he held a writing competition. He brought the entries home to his wife, Margaret Hines Roberts, who, after reading some 60 or more, came across young Tom Wolfe's. Looking up from it, she said to her husband, "This boy, Tom Wolfe, is a genius, and I want him for our school next year." It was the first time the word genius was used for him, and thus he became the first student enrolled in their North State Fitting School. Wolfe later described his 4 years there, from 1912 to 1916, as the happiest and most valuable years of my life. And as for her, she was, as one biographer wrote, this Miss Roberts, the fairy godmother of Tom's youth. She nurtured his love for writing, stirred his interest and love for literature. We called her the mother of my spirit. At the end of Wolfe's final year there, he and his father dueled over where he would go to college. He wanted to go to Princeton or Virginia, but W.O. insisted on the University of North Carolina. In his mind, at Carolina, his son would make lifelong connections that would enhance the legal and political career that he envisioned for Tom. And furthermore, though a native Pennsylvanian, no son of his was going to patronize Virginia. As W.O. put it, "No, you're a North Carolinian and you'll go to North Carolina. Go to work if you don't go to North Carolina." His mother advised Tom to give in to his father. And she put it, "After all, Papa is going to pay for it. So you take my advice, go this year, and it won't be hard to change next year." On the 10th of September, 1916, the then 15-year-old Wolfe vented his frustration to his brother-in-law, Ralph Wheaton. He wrote, "I arrived at my decision to attend our state university last Wednesday night." Perhaps I should say forced instead of arrived, for that is what it amounted to. For I had held out for the University of Virginia in spite of my family's protests. And when no reply came from the University of Virginia, I consented to go to Carolina. 2 days later, a letter did come from Virginia telling me to come on. However, it was too late. But nevertheless, Carolina is a good school, and perhaps everything is for the best. And so, as fate would have it, neatly attired in a Biltmore homespun suit, he caught the early morning train from Asheville and arrived late afternoon in Durham. His brother-in-law, Ralph, who lived in Raleigh, drove him the 12 miles to Chapel Hill. On Cameron Avenue, Tom Wolfe was dropped off at the three-story rooming house of widow Mattie Eva Hardy, an Asheville native whose place was only a block and a half from the west entrance to campus. Tom Wolfe's new universe looked something like this. Of course, there was Old East, Old West, Person, South Building, Girard and Smith, and there was New East, New West, Old Memorial Hall, Alumni, and Carr. But since 1900, Mary Ann Smith Dormitory, or the Graduate Club as it was called, was added in 1901. Then came Bynum Gymnasium and the Y Building, both in 1904. Next was completed Howell Hall for pharmacy in 1906. And in 1907, Hill Hall, Abernathy, which was the infirmary, and the new president's house. 1 year later, Old Davy, and in 1911, Caldwell. There were two new structures in 1912, Peabody, and the new dormitories, as they were called, Battle, Vance, and Pettigrew. Then was completed Swain, or Swine Dining Hall, as the students called it, in 1913. And just a year before Wolfe's arrival, Emerson Field, today where the Graduate Library and the Student Union are, this completed in 1915. All became Tom Wolfe's world. Nestled just to the north, the sleepy village of Chapel Hill numbered just over 2,000. To the north, east, and west of the university, homes of faculty and townspeople, all of which were surrounded by trees. Downtown, quite honestly, possessed little charm, as this image reinforces. Streets were unpaved. What business district they had was mostly frame, and only 4 or 5 were student haunts. South side of Franklin Street was the post office. And many students had boxes there, and twice a day students visited when the mail came in. Along Franklin, there was the Pickwick, which provided the only real entertainment in town. Often the entertainment was extracurricular, as silent movies were shown and boisterous students interrupted, and there were showers of thrown peanuts. On the north side of the street, there was Foister's, and right across from the Pickwick, there was Eubanks and Patterson Brothers Drugstore. It was there students pitched pennies, gambled, and matched coins for chocolate-covered ice cream bars called Black Cows. Of course, there was a bank, a grocery, and clothing stores. Jitney operators C.S. Pendergraft and Jack Sparrow ran touring cars 4 times a day to meet the trains that arrived in Durham. And all of this was policed by a force of 1. Chief Lacey Bunn Lloyd threatened to run in many youthful miscreants, but in reality, he arrested few. 2 days after Wolfe's arrival, he attended an orientation meeting in Girard Hall. Cheerleader Cy Parker began the meeting with cheers. Junior class president Albert Coates explained the honor system, and senior Marion Ross extolled the virtues of the literary societies. The evening ended with a reception for all freshmen inside the then home of UNC basketball, Bynum Hall. Next came enrolling for classes, and Wolfe stood in line to do so. Early on, he found that algebra and trigonometry were not his cup of tea, but he sat enthralled in his English, Latin, and Greek classes. For all his self-doubt, he attended compulsory chapel each day. It was always in Girard Hall and promptly began at 10:30 a.m. After hymns and scripture, there would be a speaker, and he heard from storied men like University President Edward Kidder Graham, Dean Marvin H. Stacy, and Professor Emeritus Kemp P. Battle. Acting on Marion Ross's advice to join a literary society, on September the 23rd, he and 37 other freshmen attended the Dialectic Society to gain membership. Composed of those from the western part of our state, they met appropriately in New West. The rustic Wolfe chamber was impressive. Comfortable chairs, an elegant rostrum for officers. Around the hall, portraits of those who had gone on to greatness. And on this particular evening, Professor Horace Williams of the Department of Philosophy spoke. Afterward, it was time for initiation. Each new member was to speak. In good fun, a sophomore rose to offer parody of some heady matter, and the freshmen were to follow suit. Most connected with the tongue-in-cheek exercise. Wolfe did not. The speech rolled on for 22 minutes, and in drawing to a close, pointed to the portrait of another native of Buncombe County, the beloved Zebulon B. Vance. As he did, Wolfe commented that he was pleased to be in such distinguished company. Then added, "I hope someday to see my picture on these walls." That remark, laughter filled the chamber. That did and never would sit well with a sensitive Thomas Wolfe. Morganton Sam Irvin was there and remembered the speech, thinking to himself that among those gathered, Wolfe would be most unlikely to have his likeness adorn the chamber's walls. That humiliating moment and a few others during his first months burned within Wolfe. He even included it in Look Homeward, Angel. Remembering through his alter ego, Eugene Gant, he wrote, "Eugene's first year at the university was filled for him with loneliness, pain, and failure. Within 3 weeks of his matriculation, he had been made the dupe of a half dozen classic jokes. His ignorance of all campus tradition had been exploited. His gullibility was a byword. He was the greenest of all green freshmen, past and present." And then to add fodder for all who enjoyed picking at him, there was his physical characteristics. He was a gangly 6'3", still growing, and weighed in at about 130 pounds. With large hands, enormous feet, unruly brown hair, and atop an unusually small head. Like other students, he wore a jacket and tie, but his trousers were high waters. His coat sleeves stopped far short of his wrists. Undaunted, 9 days later, he and a dozen other freshmen organized the Freshman Debating Club, and he was elected vice president. Despite the fact he lamented his freshman year and Look Homeward, Angel, it was not as bad as he made it. His Asheville friends were the springboard for leaping into the mainstream of campus life. In November of 1916, he left Miss Hardy's boarding house for a place somewhere, we believe, on West Franklin. For meals, he, like most others, dined at Swain Hall, which seated about 600, each paying $12.50 a month for meals. Keeping in students' nickname in mind, Swine Hall, you will not be surprised that table manners often went the way of the dinosaur, turning the dining hall experience into an arena of raucous shouting and biscuit throwing. Thanksgiving rolled around. Wolfe's father was worried that his son might be homesick, but that was not the case. Instead, Wolfe decided to follow the Tar Heel football team to Richmond for the annual Thanksgiving tilt against the university's bitter rival, Virginia. Friends, he made his way to Carborough, caught the special train, which pulled out Wednesday morning at 9:30. Round trip to and from Richmond, $3. On board, coaches, the team, faculty, students, and even custodians excitedly made their way northward. A scrub on the team borrowed Wolfe's new overcoat, And in return, he wore the scrub's old sweater, which had a big NC on it. Wolfe wore it almost bursting with pride. On that Thanksgiving Day in 1916, Carolina made a Bill Folger touchdown run stand. And for the first time since 1905, Carolina was victorious 7-0. Celebratory snake dance by Carolina students, in Wolfe's own words, was the sensation of the day. All returned bleary-eyed, but the celebrating wasn't over. President Graham and Coach T.J. Campbell made remarks in Girard Hall. There was a torch-light parade headed by the band and football team, all piling into 2 wagons. The procession made its way to Emerson Field, where around a bonfire spiked by 15 gallons of oil, Tar Heels danced about until they could dance no more and roared out cheers until every throat was in shreds. Thomas Wolfe never forgot that night. 3 years later, he even wrote an essay about the experience. He entitled it, "Ye Who Have Been There Only Know." He also made another momentous trip, this one to Durham, and with 2 older freshmen there at a brothel. He had his first sexual encounter with a prostitute who called herself Mamie Smith. Though it was false passion, those visits were periodically made to Durham and Raleigh throughout his undergraduate days. But to remain an undergraduate, he had to have the grades. He, after his first semester, survived, but showed himself to have, well, grades that made him an average student. He had a B in English and C's in mathematics, Latin, and Greek. He moved once again, this time with 3 mates from Asheville, and all crowded into a cottage owned by Kemp Battle, located beyond the Arboretum and just off the eastern boundary of campus. Wolfe thought it the perfect balance between solitude and society. If he wanted a hot shower, however, he had to head to Bynum Gymnasium. His 3 college mates and cottage mates remembered that on Fridays, Wolfe would return from the library with arms filled with books, and he would read them all weekend. One of his roomies, James Howell, thought Wolfe's height made him a candidate for the cross-country or track team. Wolfe gave it a try, but after only a few practices, that ended. He confined his athletic participation to baseball tossing and horseshoes. The social animal that he was, he loved something the Dye Society initiated, informal smokers, bull sessions. Every seat in the chamber was filled, jokes were shared, stories swapped, and sandwiches, punch, cigarettes, and cigars were in plenty. Wolfe remembered that at one, Sam Irvin recited some choice bits of his delightful poetry. Comfortable there, it was only a few weeks later he was given honorable mention in a debate on the regulation of trusts. While he enjoyed the literary society, he still rankled when anyone brought up his "I hope my portrait will one day hang in the Dye" comment. He didn't take criticism very well. Even the gentlest amount got under his skin, and that was later conveyed in Look Homeward, Angel. For whatever reason, in spring of 1917, he withdrew, he retreated, he made more frequent trips to bawdy houses in Durham and Raleigh, and often went alone. He grew careless of his appearance. And still growing, his clothes did not grow with him. He wore a hat with holes in it. And there was a twisted tie, soiled collars, and uncombed, unruly hair. Adding to his self-imposed isolation, he moved to a bare, cheerless room above Eubanks and Patterson's drugstore on Franklin Street. It was there he confessed to druggist Carl Durham that he felt persecuted and alone, lost, wind grieved. Still, His Asheville buddies kept a watchful eye on him. In other words, Wolfe was alone only when he chose to think himself so. In late April of his freshman year, he was among 20 nominated by the Athletic Council to become one of 10 associate editors of the Daily Tar Heel. He submitted a copy for inspection, but sadly did not make the cut. Yet for the occasional disappointments and self-prescribed loneliness, he, like so many before and after, well, he found a home at Carolina. Though it took a full academic year to find his identity, he began to open himself up to all this new universe offered. His favorite class and professor that first year was his Greek professor, William Stanley Bully Bernard. Then 49 years of age and from Eastern North Carolina, he was pugnacious, quick-tempered, sharply critical, did not suffer fools gladly, and yet students, though a bit frightened of him, loved his passion. A bachelor with pince-nez glasses hanging at the tip of his nose and stylish cufflinks constantly visible, he moved rapidly about the classroom, always in one hand, a piece of chalk. And if a student's answer was without thought, that piece of chalk became a projectile. While exacting in class, his blend of wit and cynicism won him a following. Indeed, Wolfe wrote of his stern charm and his fierce sword of his tongue. Another reason for his popularity was his involvement in campus activities. He directed plays, advised debaters, attended literary society meetings, spoke at chapel, taught Sunday school, and always seemed to make time for a student. Wolfe sought his advice when he debated, and from him, he came to understand form, control, and restraint in his writing. He took as his own the Greeks, as he put it, perception of beauty in the commonplace and their deep humanity. He adopted as his own Greek words and made use of their flowing and rhythmic sentences. Years later, one of Wolfe's friends spoke of the bond the two had. He liked Horace Williams, but I rather think that he regarded Bully as a greater philosopher. 2 semesters complete, he headed back to Asheville. It was a memorable trip, and that was because a trip to Anderson, South Carolina to visit one of his sisters was good, and at home for falling in love with Clara Paul, who came to board that summer at his mother's old Kentucky home. Engaged to be married to a soldier, she was 5 years Wolfe's senior. But to him, that did not matter. She wrote about it all to her sister down in Eastern North Carolina. She wrote, "A nice young boy here, the son of my landlady, has a crush on me. He hopes to be a writer. He has much talent, I think. The most trivial thing he says sounds like poetry." Of course, I told him right away that I was engaged. I explained that I could never return his feelings. I was real sorry for him, but he seemed to understand. He'll get over it, I feel sure. He probably confided to her that he hoped to transfer to Princeton. But once again, he lost that battle with his father, who, after all, was footing the bill. In mid-August, he, with tongue-in-cheek, wrote his freshman English professor, Holly Hanford, that if he went to Princeton, he supposed poor old UNC will in time manage to lift its drooping head and bear up under the loss. By the 13th of September, he returned to Chapel Hill and found the campus an essentially military encampment. The country drifted toward war in Europe. Many of Wolfe's friends had enlisted. Campus football was dropped. A wounded Canadian Army captain and 2 assistants were in charge of 4 student-comprised companies. And though Wolfe was too young to enlist, he was required to attend 5 hours of military lectures a week. In Battle Park, he helped dig a trench, which was, of course, used in training. He was in University First Platoon, Company C. While war fever infected the student body, he and those still too young maintained, as best they could, student routine. As he wrote, our lives moved to the tolling of the great bell in South Building. For the first time, he now lived in a college dormitory, one of the new dorms, as they were called. Completed in 1912, he was in Battle Dorm number 4. Cost $10 a month, and that was steeper than where he had been as a freshman. But now he had hot water. He and 2 others shared a suite of rooms on the southeast corner. New room, new roommates, and a more mature Thomas Wolfe. Well, except for one brush with the student council. He and 2 others took 2 freshmen to hunt cedar birds in the nearby woods. We would today know that as snipe hunting, and for it, Wolfe and a friend got into trouble. They were fortunate to escape unscathed. Once again, he found himself in Bernard's Greek class and even dabbled in Frank P. Venable's general descriptive chemistry class and introduction to psychology. The latter 2 left little impression, but Edwin A. Greenlaw's survey of English literature struck home. Native of Illinois, Greenlaw so enthralled Wolfe that he took classes from the professor each of his last 3 years. Often, to provoke thinking, Greenlaw baited students with intriguing questions like, was Shakespeare's Ophelia a nice girl? Would she object to cabbage being cooked in the home? Would she drive a Packard or be content with a Model T Ford? It would be in Wolfe's junior year that he took Greenlaw's English 21 composition class, which was based upon current affairs. One of his classmates was Paul Green. That class met at the north end of the 2nd floor in Old East. And the following scene was repeated many times. Wolfe, having overslept, would dress in a rush, scribble his assignment on bits of paper, then race to class. Greenlaw, having begun class, would hear pounding footsteps, have the door burst open, and not only late, Wolfe, without pencil or text, would rush to his seat. There would be a pregnant pause in Greenlaw's delivery. Then inevitably would come, Brother Wolfe, we welcome you. Will you read the burning words you have written for us? And so, as one remembered, before the class, Wolfe would dig into his pockets for the bits of paper on which he had that morning dashed down. And inevitably, he would hold all spellbound with what he had written. On days when he did not read, Greenlaw would wait for Wolfe to take his seat, then resume with, now that the thunder has passed. The best story to come out of all of that concerns a writing assignment on the theme, Who Am I? As usual, for that class, Wolfe was late. He stood in the doorway with all eyes on him, then from behind his back, produced a cylinder of toilet paper, rolled it out on the floor, explaining it was all he had to use for writing material the night before. Of course, the class roared with laughter, and Greenlaw told him, all right, go ahead and read it. Some 12 paragraphs in, Greenlaw interrupted, Mr. Wolfe, all I can say is, by God, it's written on the right kind of paper. Despite what one may think, the 2 thoroughly enjoyed one another. And a few years after leaving Chapel Hill, Wolfe wrote to him, I shall always put an endearing value on your friendship. You are one of the best teachers in the world. Indeed, Wolfe wrote that Greenlaw was one of the great creative forces of my life. That was evident. As a sophomore in Greenlaw's survey of English literature, Thomas Wolfe made his first A. It was also about the time that the idea of becoming a writer really began to take shape and manifested itself when he wrote a poem for the university magazine. Its printing pleased his father, who, despite the literary bend, still hoped his son would become an attorney and go into politics. By now, as a sophomore, Thomas Wolfe was very much at home in Chapel Hill and at Carolina. He thought both idyllic. His clowning and obvious ability to charm and to write brought him, much to his pleasure, popularity. In a letter to his mother, he wrote, "Find myself an everlasting source of interest. Sounds egotistical, doesn't it? College life does more things for one than I would have ever dreamed." And yet, despite this oft-used photo, he remained a slob. Curly, unmanageable hair, often in borrowed shirt, coat, and trousers. He thought himself the unwashed genius. In March of 1918, he had another poem published in the university magazine. That edition also published his first work of fiction, A Culloden of Virginia. It was, however, the poem entitled The Challenge, which brought him a sudden burst of fame. Patriotic piece, it was favorably reviewed, and those reviews were copied in the Durham newspaper. On the 5th of April, 1918, the Asheville Citizen not only reprinted the review, but included the entire 6-stanza poem. His father beamed. That spring of 1918, Thomas Wolfe plunged into student life and activities as if there was no tomorrow. That was evident when he sought membership and was initiated into Pi Kappa Phi fraternity, but he wanted more. Incredibly, dressed to the nines, he attended the Easter dances, joined the literary fraternity Sigma Upsilon and Omega Delta, whose stated purpose was the promotion and stimulation of the aesthetic and intellectual side of college life. That translated into those committed to writing and the production of plays. And he wasn't done. May the 7th, he was initiated into Amphoterapy, which promoted extemporaneous speaking, good citizenship, good government. Not done yet, he was appointed an associate editor of the Acadiac, and on the 15th of May was elected class poet. 2 days later, he was named one of 2 assistant editors of the Tar Heel. All this activity found its way into Look Homeward Angel and his story and alter ego, Eugene Gant. Wolfe wrote, Eugene began to join. He joined everything. He had never belonged to any group before, but now all groups were beckoning him. He had, without much trouble, won a place for himself on the staff of the college paper and the magazine. Small beginning trickle of distinctions widened into a gushet. It began to sprinkle, then it rained. He was initiated into literary fraternities, dramatic fraternities, theatrical fraternities, speaking fraternities, journalistic fraternities, and in the spring into a social fraternity. He joined enthusiastically, submitted with fanatical glee to the barred mauling of the initiations, and went about lame and sore, more pleased than as a child or as a savage, with colored ribbons in his coat lapel and a waistcoat plastered with pins, badges, symbols, and Greek printing. And yet, the fact that his calling was literary, his father still harbored hopes that his Thomas would become an attorney or governor of the state. This was his father's stone cutting shop at 22 South Court Street in Pack Square, Asheville. While Thomas found himself in his sophomore year at Carolina, his father found himself for a second time at Johns Hopkins Hospital, battling prostate cancer. The rising junior spent the summer of 18 in Norfolk. He worked at odd jobs, and one of those was carpentering. He bought some tools, reported to work July 7th, and lasted one day when the foreman realized Wolfe may have had tools, but had no skill to use them. By now, with America's active involvement in World War I, UNC did not open until September the 26th. Back in Chapel Hill, President Graham welcomed some 1,100 students in what was now called the Armory, formerly Memorial Hall. Graham announced the semester system had been replaced by the quarter system. Study of German was abolished, and only an improvised football season would be played. The war on everyone's minds, UNC was again essentially a camp. Dormitories were called barracks, and the university had been converted into a unit of the Student Army Training Corps. Victory Gardens were planted behind Peabody Hall, and when not drilling or in class, student cadets policed the village and college grounds. Much to Wolfe's chagrin, his age kept him out of the SATC, but he was numbered in the university bulletin, a catch-all, or the university battalion, a catch-all for all rejected or ineligible. At the start of his junior year, he shared a room in the three-story Pickard Hotel. You see an image of it then, and Graham Memorial where it was placed. He and a medical student from Statesville shared a dark attic room, which had a gabled window that looked out on Franklin Street. In its parlor, there was a piano and card tables, and students gathered there before and after meals, and always Wolfe was in the center ring entertaining one and all. Their friends remembered that he smoked cigarettes, and when doing so, gave the impression he was eating them. His two fingers in the cigarette he held entered his mouth at seemingly the same time. Also by this time, he was actively involved in the Tar Heel. He wrote the editorials, and most of all, the copy. However, in mid-October, disturbing news brought his activities to a standstill. His brother, Ben, came down with influenza, which was sweeping the nation. On October the 19th, 1918, the flu took him. Benjamin's passing affected Tom greatly. In fact, he later wrote, "The Asheville I knew died for me when Ben died. I've never forgotten him, and I never shall. I think his death affected me more than any other event in my life." His brother's death provided perhaps one of the most provocative passages in Look Homeward, Angel, when Wolfe wrote, "We can believe in the nothingness of life. We can believe in the nothingness of death and of life after death. But who can believe in the nothingness of Ben?" And to add to his grief, Tom was visibly shaken when he saw his father's deteriorating condition. He wrote of the debilitating cancer which robbed W.O. of his life force. The impending doom, like watchers were we on a city wall. If the enemy comes behind, who will be next? Indeed, it came from an unexpected quarter. When a week after Ben died, UNC President Edward Kidder Graham died of the same influenza. The loss of this idolized man dropped a dark veil across campus. And sadly, incredibly, 3 months later, the man who assumed Graham's role, Marvin H. Stacy, was also dead of influenza at the tender age of 41. Reeling, Wolfe tried to stay busy. He succeeded. He committed himself in reviving the membership and reputation of the Dye Society. He and Luther Hodges lobbied for a female representative on the editorial board of the Yakety Yak, but did so unsuccessfully. The Dye Society chose he and 3 others as featured debaters. And then came another blow. Though it may sound strange to us today, but to his and other students' great disappointment, World War I ended. To them, they had missed what they believed was the potential for a great adventure. As Wolfe put it, war was glorious and magnificent, that it offered us 1,000 chances for glory, adventure, and joy. In January of 1919, he and 6 others moved to a new location, Fraternity Road. They settled in on January the 7th. And that is a good place for us to end part 1 and to pick up with the undergraduate days of Thomas Wolfe here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thanks for joining me. Thanks to Grant and Douglas and to all of you for being with us for part one, Thomas Wolfe, and hope that you will join us for part two.